Hello, welcome. Um, yeah, we had some issues there, but now we can begin. We're doing Antebellum Westward expansion. All right. So with this, hopefully you could see this as I share it. It's a pretty long one. All right. So number one, American conservatism created a giant. Mexican idealism created strife and vulnerability. What I'm doing in number one is I'm showing how the United States was able to become strong enough economically and demographically and politically to take the far west from Mexico. The bully is becoming powerful. All right. So you saw this in another, I believe, in another handout. My contention that the ideological gap between left and right amongst founding fathers was arguably not that far. You can make the argument that Jefferson was really not that far to the left, and Hamilton and Adams were really not that far to the right. And so, hence, they developed kind of a conservative compromise, not to hit some of the most pivotal, touchy institutions, practices, topics, etc. So, for one, right, is they allowed the states to decide on enfranchisement, on citizenship rights, or citizenship, and who was entitled to such and who wasn't. They didn't touch slavery, right? Um, they created a mixed government, a mixed republic that was partly democratic, partly aristocratic, and partly monarchical. They did agree on separation of church and state, on a Bill of Rights, on no landed nobility, on a republican form of government being guaranteed to all the states, on with the um supremacy clause of the Constitution being the law and the authority of the land. We, the people, by way of the social contract, give our consent and give that authority to the Constitution. So they had some enlightened shared beliefs. But as far as, property redistribution, political equality for all human beings, citizenship, rights, an end to slavery, enfranchising Native Americans, enfranchising women, we weren't ready to touch any of those things. So because of this kind of conservative consensus, we could focus on the economy. Um, yes, you have your elections like in 1796 and 1800 between Adams and Jefferson, and they very much, articulated some great fears if the other guy were to win. But because, no one, they each stepped down when they beat each other. 96, Jefferson lost. 1800, Jefferson won, and Adams lost. They were able to step down, I would argue, because that rhetoric during the campaign was hyperbole. It was exaggerated, or it was a strategic exaggeration, and they really knew that they were not that fundamentally different from one another. So at any rate, they had peaceful transitions of power. And so then I focus on the primarily the system, if you will, of Hamilton and developments that emanated from that system. So the development of infrastructure, all right, the uh, subsidization or government help financially to encourage diversity, economic diversity and self-sufficiency to a myriad of different industries that were coming of age. Then I get into the development of interchangeable parts, the steam engine and steam-powered machinery. Um, I get into aggrandizing the frontier. And then I make a contrary claim with Latin America, including Mexico, whereby their left and their right were quite far from each other on the spectrum. And so, therefore, it did seem like the end of the world as they knew it when their opponents won. And so, hence, they would overthrow one another. They had coups. They had scrapped constitutions and replaced by new ones. And really, the first president of a republic, Guadalupe Victoria, he was the only guy to just finish his term peacefully without being thrown out by a coup, um, etc., or have to face a civil war. So Mexico, on the contrary, they didn't develop the same type of business infrastructure by way of a plan with subsidized roads, canals, later railroads, as the U.S. was able to concentrate on. Their judiciary didn't make things quite safe for business investment, as happened in the U.S. And so hence the U.S. Uh, grows at the expense of Mexico. So I kind of wanted to just go over how the U.S. became empowered to take over the far West. And then I get into the origins of the overland trails with the mountain men, with the Methodist and Baptist missionaries, with the expeditions of Lewis and Clark, Pike, Fremont, etc. And so at any rate, yeah, all of that kind of adds up to the United States becoming powerful, land hungry, and branching its influence further and further westwardly. All right. Increased squatters' rights, elected judges. That's all going to play a part. Right. And a lot of information that I got from that came from John MacFarrager and David Wasserman. I have footnotes at the bottom. All right. So at any rate, number two, I state that the men of the Alamo were products of de Tocqueville's description of Jackson's era. So I believe we've just done Jackson's era. So I don't know how much of this, I don't know how deep to go into it as far as repetition. Um, but as you probably recall, um, critics are going to contend that this was a time of tyranny of the majority, okay, whereby Americans are going to expect what they perceive to be equality of economic opportunity for all white men, government either help or government abstention and staying out of the way in their quest to the American dream. So they were offered easy credit with the wildcat banks. They were often offered Native American lands with the eminent domain laws of Georgia and the Carolinas and the Trails of Tears, and the list goes on. And so, of examples of tyranny of the majority with this newly enfranchised poor white demographic, poor white male demographic. And so, in particular, the Scots-Irish, as stated in that handout, had developed quite a reputation for being libertarian, for being distrustful toward government, wanting to carve out a life of their own without government intervention, and expecting to achieve the American dream. And also, right, we talked about culturally under Alexis de Tocqueville, how Americans, there was an element of populism, the negative sentiments, the negative thoughts, the distrust of urbanites, the distrust of intellectuals, the distrust of foreigners, and yes, a disdain almost for Latinos and African Americans. And that was not only not curbed, it was championed. It was enhanced. It was fomented by their elected politicians to get votes, arguably. So at any rate, when you put all that together, right, it makes perfect sense that the Scots-Irish Southern libertarians during Jackson's era are going to go into Eastern Texas and act like it's theirs to take. All right. So at any rate, um, they come in, they receive all that land that you see there, 4,438 acres of land for free. They have a certain number of years of tax exemption. All that is asked of them is that they learn the Castilian Spanish language, become Roman Catholic, and follow Mexican law. And of course, they don't do any of that. According to Mier y Terán, he comes up with a famous expedition and he says, guys, the gringos are enterprising. Yes, they are. And remember, that's an adjective that they're going to incorporate into Manifest Destiny, is that they are economically progressive. They're hardworking and diligent, the whole Protestant work ethic stuff, and that they're forward thinking as far as developing grist mills and sawmills and other kind of progressive economic practices, grog shops for metallurgical objects to be made, etc. But he said they're not just enterprising, however, they're haughty, they're arrogant and defiant in that arrogance. And they feel as if they have no one to rule over them, that no one has the right to rule over them. They outnumber the Tejanos, the ethnic Mexican Texans, 8-1 at least. And Mieri Teran said something needs to be done. So Congress and President Bustamante of Mexico are going to inaugurate the April 6th colonization law of 1830. And it's going to state that there's to be no more North American immigration into Eastern Texas. There is to be there are to be deportations for those who are not following Mexican law. And one of the main trespasses was illegally bringing in slaves. Okay, they're to pay their taxes and they're to abide by Mexican law or they're out of here. They also wanted to populate Eastern Texas with more ethnic Mexicans and create more presidios or military forts with soldiers there as well. So, of course, then you get into great man history when Stephen Austin comes down, supposedly trying to adjudicate, to kind of referee this difference. And instead, he gets put in prison for 15 months. Supposedly, he had a bit of an ego clash with President Gomez Farias. And he's put in prison instead for threatening treason by saying that the Texans will rebel and gain independence if you don't compromise on this April 6th colonization law. So he sends a famous letter back to this city council, the Cabildo of San Antonio, pretty much giving his green light, saying if the Warhawks are the majority and that's what you want, then do whatever you need to do from this point forward, that the Mexican government is chaotic and that it is obstinate, it's stubborn. So at any rate, then what gives them the supposed pretext to break free is the Seven Laws Constitution, the Siete Leyes under Santa Anna. Okay. So it's a centralist constitution. It weakened, you see here, it weakened state legislators. It made state governors handpicked by the president instead of being elected. It dissolved some checks and balances between the three branches. It placed the state militias directly under the president. And it disenfranchised 80% of the Mexican people with property requirements for citizenship. So technically, at the Alamo and so forth, they fought for a return to the liberal 1824 Mexican Constitution. All right, that's what they're going to contend against this tyrant. And so he's not just opposed by the Texans. He's opposed by the governor of Zacatecas, who refuses to step down, says he's been elected, says the state militia belongs to him and not President Santa Anna. And so they have a little war. And Santa Anna's army that he raises defeats the Zacatecan governor. And then he begins to march from there upward, northwardly to Texas. Texas and Coahuila beneath it were united as one state. Coahuila y Tejas was the name of the united state. And by that time in Saltillo, Coahuila, the capital, quite a few of the ethnic Mexicans stepped down. said, okay, we still oppose this uber conservative constitution that does largely take away local autonomy and representative government. But we're not going to fight our own president and our own people's army. But a lot of the ethnic Anglos, including some Tejanos, in Texas, they were more stubborn and they refused to step down. So he sends his brother-in-law with the last name of Perfecto de Cos upward toward Gonzales, and he orders the Anglos to not uh, take over any of the presidios, which they already begun to do, and orders them to evacuate the said presidios, and they fired a cannon at him instead. So he came back and returned to his brother-in-law, Santa Anna declared Deguello that he would not take prisoners once he came up and punished the Texan rebels. So some of them, about 200 of them, agreed to stay down in San Antonio, out at an old building that had once been, I think it's connected somehow to algodón, the Spanish name for cotton. It was like a cotton place. It was also before that a mission. But at any rate, they stayed there stubbornly, and he got there at the end of February of 1836 with quite an army. The number I see quite often is roughly 6,000 soldiers. And so around the 6th of March, they broke through one of the parapets, one of the walls, just before dawn, and they killed almost everyone in there, with the exception of a black servant, an elderly woman, a couple children, etc. And so, but before they did that, William Barrett Travis had sent out a circular. And the circular, right, it didn't make it look as if it was just liberty-loving Democrats fighting against an uber conservative tyrant. Look what he says here: liberty-loving Anglos come and fight against this mongrel Spanish, Indian, and Negro race. So they're making it out to be ethnic as well. You have Erasmo and Juan Seguin, Seguin, with an accent over the I. The Seguin father and son are going to be rescued from the Alamo by virtue of a diplomatic errand that they were sent on at the last minute. Otherwise, they would have been in the Alamo themselves. But they fought for a return to the 1824 Constitution, and then eventually they were for an independent Texas, along with the Anglos there. But the son is going to end up leaving because he becomes so disgusted by the racist treatment that he incurs from the Anglos there. So it seems, according to Chicano historians, like there's more to it than a fight for representative government and local autonomy against an uber conservative, somewhat tyrannical president of Santa Ana. To the Chicano historians, that was their pretext. That was their excuse. All right. Then number three is pretty simple thesis, right? Is I'd grown up on great man history of the Mexican-American War, and I learned early about the way by which two consecutive presidents contributed to fomenting that war. Okay. I read about some senators that were war hawks and wanted land in the West and coveted New Mexico, California, etc. But that's about the story would always stop there. And then you read about the leaders in the Mexican War and not much else. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to do a little bit more of history from below. All right. And contend that no, if you're going to play the blame game and do conflict history with the Mexican-American War, uh, throw the blame where it deserves to be, and that is popularly on that entire generation of Americans, not just their elected leaders. All right. So, a couple things to me are of note that demonstrate the that thesis. Okay, the possible validity of that thesis is for one, right? The pressure that was placed upon um, those who were hungry for political office. There's an instance in which Henry Clay, because Henry Clay fits that bill of being a very ambitious um, politician from Kentucky. And so he is told more than once that his moral opposition to a Mexican war to take California from Mexico is going to cost him the presidency. And somehow, eventually, he becomes convinced of it himself. And so he issues his famous second letter, his second Alabama letter that goes throughout the press. And he says, while I still personally have an antipathy for the idea of going to war with Mexico and taking California from her, um, I am the servant of my voters and I'll do as they please. So if that's what they want, if they want a war, then I'll vote for one. All right. And to me, that speaks volumes right there. That this guy, wanted to personally, morally, wanted to oppose this war, but felt beholden to support it if he wanted to stay in office and if he wanted to gain the presidency. And then as for the presidency, right? From what I've understood, come to understand in reading some of uh, these books that you see footnoted at the bottom of the pages, is they contend that Polk did not have much of a domestic platform at all, as far as what his visions were for governing, uh, his philosophy with the government and the economy, um, his stance on states' rights versus federal domination, anything with slavery, etc. He didn't touch upon really any of that, but he almost solely campaigned on foreign policy, and he made it amply clear he wanted California. He wanted California, and if he had to go to war with Mexico, he would. He even said that it was such a single issue scenario for him that he promised to only run for one term because that's all he wanted to accomplish. And so he was a dark horse. He was not well known. He had not been through all of the typical historical stepping stones that usually were entailed when someone eventually became president. Oftentimes, you became the Speaker of the House. Then you gained a Senate chair, and then in the Senate, you were usually in charge of one of the bigger committees like Foreign Relations Committee, etc. Um, and then oftentimes you were chosen in the cabinet of the president, and for whatever reason, so often it was Secretary of State in particular that people were chosen to before they would run for president. And so he had accomplished none of that. That the regular quote route to the presidency, he had not taken it. And but nevertheless, this dark horse comes in, runs on a single issue, and wins the presidency by electoral college, right? It's not direct popular vote, but it's close to it. And the American people elected him, all right? Then you have primary source quotes from people like Abraham Lincoln and other contemporaries who opposed this war. And it's very clear that they felt that those who had a very pro-war sentiment were the majority. They clearly constituted the majority of their generation. All right. Then in particular, you have quotes from molders of American thought, like writers like Richard Henry Dana, who visited Mexican California and said, just imagine if in the hands of a more industrious and enterprising people, how just how much development would happen here in this beautiful state of California if that were the case. Um, you had Thomas Farnham write similarly. You have senators who have quotes about Mexican people that are very degrading and they're supposed to be the cream of the crop. They're one step removed from being popularly elected at this time, and they're still articulating this type of racist sentiment. Okay. And then you have newspaper accounts of just general statements about the entire generation. And I began with one from John Quincy Adams, all right, who also opposed this war. So, as I say here, evidence suggests that these rulers were simply carrying out a popular demand. Okay. Now, going back to great man history as far as the leaders, the annexation of Texas. Texas won its independence at San Jacinto River by capturing Santa Ana. He had had his army split into three, and they united as one, and he felt invulnerable because of their unity and their numbers. And before dawn, they were surprised by Sam Houston's army. And so he was captured, and in return for his life, he surrendered Texas to these rebels. So from 1836 to 1845, for those 9 years, Texas was its own republic, its own country. All right. Um, and the Mexican Congress uh, acted to remove Santa Anna as the president. They were so disgusted over him losing Texas. And they made it clear that they would suspend diplomatic relations and mobilize their army if the U.S. ever tried to annex Texas as a new state, because Mexico planned on getting it back. So at any rate, Tyler, he's got nothing to lose. He's the only president I know who was kicked out by his own party, the Whigs, because he acted like a Southern Democrat, being from the South. Um, and so at any rate, he's got nothing to lose. He's a sitting duck president waiting to leave from the election of Polk. And so he asked Congress to annex Texas. And again, the elected reps in the House, as well as those who were elected by elected reps of the states, the senators, give their okay to this as well, right? To annex Texas. And Polk comes in and he supports it as well. And so the argument is that we picked this fight, okay? And then in addition to that, on two different occasions, Polk had sent an ambassador to Mexico to try to purchase California. And he should have known that it was considered a personal affront to the Mexican Republic and to the Mexican people to even try to buy it. But nevertheless, he sent Poinsett and Slidell to try to buy it, and of course to no avail. And so then he picks a fight, arguably, over the southern border of Texas. He contends that it's the Rio Bravo del Norte that we call the Rio Grande, and the Mexican government contended from the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 that the old Spanish border of southern Texas was the Nueces, which is further up. So this strip of territory that we're talking about is not very big, and you see it on the map. But nevertheless, I think you can see what's going to happen. You can anticipate it. The president sent American troops over the Nueces, across the Nueces River to the northern shore of the Rio Grande. So remember, to Mexico, we're already on Mexican territory because we've crossed the Nueces. But according to us, right, we're still on U.S. soil because we have yet to cross the Rio Grande. So at any rate, some cavalrymen went on a so-called reconnaissance tour, and they got in a firefight with Mexican soldiers, and 16 of them were shot off their horses and killed. And so Polk says American blood has been shed on American soil, and he gets the support from both houses, okay, to go to war with Mexico. So he sent Zachary Taylor to the north, Winfield Scott to the south. Winfield Scott very likely was not just being pragmatic, but being symbolic in his route that he took. He took the route taken almost exactly by Hernan Cortez against the Aztec, into Veracruz and into Mexico City. And the Americans are going to win primarily based upon, well, I would say the strategy was pretty effective, but most of all, we had a technological advantage. There's a place called Cerro Gordo, Cerro, and then Gordo. Um, Overnight, we used a pulley system with like sheet metal to get cannon up on a mountaintop so steep and so high that the Mexican people, the army, was flabbergasted that we'd been able to do such, especially just overnight. So Cerro Gordo was emblematic of that. Uh, Blunders by the Mexican army. Um, I would say Buena Vista. Zachary Taylor had had more than half of his men taken from him by Winfield Scott, as Winfield Scott said he was higher ranked and his taking of Mexico City was more important than Zachary Taylor's fight in the north. And so Zachary Taylor, outnumbered by Santa Anna, fought defensively at Buena Vista, and they had four trenches to go back to, right, just in case they were losing. They were back to their fourth and final trench and almost out of ammunition. And Santa Anna had no idea, and he just quit, inexplicably quit and left. Said he was sickened by all the losses that he incurred, because obviously, right, when you get the invention of repeating rifles and cannon, those who fight offensively in an attack against such are going to incur heavy casualties. And so he said he was sick of the carnage and that his men were out of supplies. So little did he know that he was so close to winning that battle. And then you also had them kind of shooting themselves in the foot with their lack of unity. They're going to have from 46 to 48 in this war, they're going to have like three different presidents. All right. They're still going to have coups even during the war. So they were politically disunited. Um, and they were so on the battlefield as well. I remember there was a guy named Valenzuela, and he was hated by another Mexican officer. And he ran out of ammunition, asked the other officer, it was like Ortega or something, asked him to bring him more ammunition. And Ortega said no. And Valenzuela was left without the ammunition he greatly needed. The Americans came, he had to surrender. And they said, surrender your ordnance, right? Your cannon, your bullets, your gunpowder. And he said, you know, if I had ammunition, you wouldn't be standing here. And so they shot themselves in the foot as well. And then when they fought in the South, right? Like that's where Cerro Gordo happened. And their attack on Mexico City was pretty brilliant. They had a feint attack, and then the real hit was going to be somewhere else. And the feint attack worked so well that they, on the spot, improvised and went with the feint instead of the second one that the Mexicans were waiting for. And so they made some wise decisions in hindsight. Um, they had the Battle of Chapultepec, where the young Mexican cadet threw himself off the castle as the last survivor, draped in a Mexican flag. And that goes down in Mexican folklore to this day, and at their cadet academy. And Winfield Scott is really going to have his hands full when he takes the capital. He's going to make his men go to mass. He's going to publicly execute and whip his own men for violations of what they called the Articles of War. They're just literally a decade away of having Geneva in the midst of the Crimean War back in the old world. But they still had already met together with conferences, and it kind of emanates from the Catholic Church and its notions of just war doctrine. The reasons for which you fight and the manner by which you fight are to be considered upright, lest you be guilty of the sin of murder in fighting the war as a good Catholic. So at any rate, he tried to follow what he perceived to be international law, publicly punished his own men, could not wait to get out of Mexico City. He had his hands full. And that oftentimes happens whereby it's a bit easier to conquer a city than it is to occupy it afterwards. And it is true that there was a decision made by many Southern House reps and senators not to take more land than we already did, than we will do, from Mexico in this war, because of the racist belief that it would incorporate too many bronze-colored Mexican people with indigenous blood in their veins. They didn't want to include a large segment of Mexican people under the American flag. So ironically, racism helped play a part in limiting how much land we took from Mexico. All right. And then the manner by which it was fought, you had people saying, they get off on furlough, for instance, and they refuse to leave. So I haven't had a chance to shoot a Mexican yet. Um, Raping Mexican women just absolutely is in the primary sources that it happened quite often. And Winfield Scott tries to heavily punish that and deter it. All right. And then in California, the gringos had been let in by what the Chicano historians see as a Trojan horse in the Bidwell Bartleson group. Bidwell Bartleson, those are the two last names of the leaders. See, starting in 1843, a lot of Americans began traveling across the Oregon Trail, and they in doing so, they found not only the gap from the mountain men and others, not only the South Pass, 2 mile gap in the Rocky Mountains, but they found a gap in the Sierra Nevada in the Sacramento Valley as well. So the Mexicans of California pretty much knew, the authorities knew that's where the gringos will end up coming through, infiltrating. And sure enough, it was. And Bidwell and Bartleson, like many other groups, because of the alleged dangers that were inherent on the trip to the West, they thought there'd be safety in numbers. They drew up their own private constitutions. They would oftentimes have as many as 30 wagons tied together, traveling together as Conestoga wagons filled with family members and friends. So they came, and a lot of them were pastors and teachers and farmers and artisans. So they seemed to be not only enterprising and kind of forward looking, kind of progressive, but they also seemed to Vallejo, the comandante general of the Mexican soldiers in California, to be harmless, to be benign. So he says, let him in. And of course, he'll live to regret that. And because after them come people like Isaac Graham, who became scoundrel-like figures in the primary sources, stirring up trouble in Mexican California. You had the three trips of John C. Fremont, who was an adherent to Manifest Destiny. Remember, Manifest Destiny states that it's not only meant to be for America to take the entire continent from east to west coast, but the people that are taken over should be thankful and will be better off for it because they'll have economic opportunities that they normally wouldn't have had, and they will have political freedoms that they normally would not have been able to enjoy, supposedly. So you're welcome as we take you over. So at any rate, with this Manifest Destiny sentiment, um, people knew that Fremont adhered to that. And technically, he was just a part of the zoological and topographical crew of the armed forces, like Lewis and Clark, to look at the animal and plant life, the geographic markers, etc., throughout the West, the far West. But on his second and third of his three trips into Mexican California, he no longer has the paperwork that he had before. So something's fishier now. And he changed his stories a couple times on the third and final time. And so they give him an ultimatum, the Mexican authorities under Juan Alvarez, to get out of Mexican California and not come back. Remember, he's in a U.S. uniform. So he goes up to the Oregon border, and we know today that he met with a guy named Archibald Gillespie, who was an American spy. And they're going to begin coordinating in Monterey for the naval landing at Monterey with another American who was supposed to be loyal to the Mexican government there in California. And his name was Thomas Oliver Larkin. And so war breaks out. As soon as he finds out, he gets evidence of war between US and Mexico, he immediately and defiantly enters again into Mexican California. And he has delivered into his hands the so-called bear flaggers. So Ezekiel Merritt and these other group of a lot of them, again, were kind of like Scots-Irish frontiersmen from the Kentucky and Tennessee region. Um, they took Vallejo hostage while he was having breakfast with his daughters. And, he was a leader of the Mexican army in California. And, they declared a bear flag republic like Texas had done, right, with their own republic. But literally, like 10 days later, they just willingly handed him over to Fremont of the U.S. Armed Forces. So a lot of people doubt their sincerity in wanting to just act on their own, but that they were part of a bigger conspiracy of taking California and incorporating it and annexing it as a new American state. All right. The fighting in Northern California, Chicano historians to this day bemoan the fact that they don't see much spirit and passion in Monterey and in San Francisco and in Northern California, but that won't be the case in Southern California. LA, for instance, it took a lot to squash the rebellion there of Californios, of ethnic Mexican Californians. And then even when they did, they felt vulnerable enough that they imposed martial law. They had a curfew and strict rules for the Mexican people, and they were kicked out of the city and had to come back and recapture it a second time. And that was with let's see here, Sloat came in the Navy as well as Redfield Stockton. And then Kearney had the brunt of forces on land coming through New Mexico and the Santa Fe Trail and the Old Spanish Trail into Southern California. And then, of course, Fremont is going to help Kearney. And so, at any rate, California is taken from Mexico. And then, of course, right, um, the war ended formally February 2nd, 1848, by way of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Gold was discovered and very quickly put into the press on January 24th, 1848. So literally the final 8 days of the war, gold is found. That could not have been more inauspicious for the Mexican people because it's going to bring in a flood of gringos, right, by way of the California gold rush into this newly conquered California. All right, let's see here. Turner's thesis. This is a romantic thesis, right? As he contends, he says that the West was so filled and riddled with indiscriminate. That is a very, very that is an adjective that is vital to his thesis. Okay, that supposedly the West offered indiscriminate dangers, but also indiscriminate opportunities, so that it renewed American equality of economic opportunity, or the fancy word they use is meritocracy, right? You rise or fall according to your own merit. And there's a bit of Darwinian theme to his book, right? That sometimes you just had to be lucky. You just had to have luck. And then you had to be quick-witted. You had to be tough. You had to be individualistic. And you could make it in the West as anyone, as a woman, as a black man, as someone who was dirt poor on the East Coast coming over here. Supposedly you had, virtually the same chances as those who were WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and like white-skinned males, if you were well-to-do in the East Coast, etc. So to him, the West is what makes Americana what it is, a land of equal opportunity economically. All right. So to support that, if I had to try to support that romantic thesis, you could find indiscriminate dangers in the West for sure. Disease, accidents, weather, animal attacks, Native American attacks. Absolutely. The northern route, you had to worry about the Kiowa. You had to, on the Great Plains, you had to worry about the Crow, who were known to extort passersby. You had to worry about the Shoshone when you went through the Sierra Nevada. And yeah, the Mandan Mountains had the Blackfeet, and they were highly feared. The southern route of Santa Fe Trail, you had to contend with the Comanche, the Apache, and other tribes as well. And let's see here. Most of the deaths that were registered were by disease and accidents, not murder. All right. But it did happen. There's an old school historian named Candy Moulton, and Candy Moulton goes over instances of people being gored to death by roaming bulls, stampeded to death by bison herds, etc., dying of hypothermia or a snow avalanche, uh, drowning in one of the rivers. Supposedly, the Platte River in Nebraska at the very beginning was very deceitful, very deceiving. It looked placid on top, but it had quite an undertow, and a lot of people drowned in it. The Columbia River and the Snake River had high level falls and were very, very difficult to traverse in a canoe. And then if you weren't in the canoe, you had hostile tribes that you had to contend with if you went adjacent to the river on foot. All right. There had been a guy named Robert Stewart, and he went in reverse fashion from Oregon during the War of 1812, or just at the end of it, uh, from Oregon back to Missouri, kind of backwards along the Oregon Trail. And you see the whole gamut of the stereotypical dangers of the West in his biography. Uh, one point they were, just to be dramatic, one point they were so dehydrated that they drank their own urine. Animal attacks, being extorted by the Crow on more than one occasion, etc. The weather, the rivers, and all that. And then also you have the added component that Polk, he did not follow, he did not ask Congress to follow the Northwest ordinances. Under the Northwest ordinances, right, they make a very thorough series of claims as to who owns what land. They put everything into 6-acre square plots, and then so many of those for a city, so many of those for a county, and so many of those for a future state had to be extracted from it. And that's why you see that kind of quilt pattern look on the landscape when you're flying in a plane. Okay. And, it was a very methodical process. And he ordered it not to be followed in California. He just told people, just trespass, go get that gold. And he just encouraged trespassing. And then also, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was to guarantee um, property rights to Mexicans for whom the saying goes, they had not crossed the border crossed them, right? They were here when it was Mexico, and then now they're under a new American flag. So they're entitled to their rights of citizenship according to that treaty. All right, but we're going to see soon that treaty did not safeguard them very effectively. And so you had all kinds of dangers. Uh, in 1848, um, or well, actually more so in 1849, right? The famous 49ers, over 80,000 registered from Independence, Missouri, to cross the Oregon Trail. That's just who registered. Not all did, and some took, the California Mormon Trail and started at a different point. Some took the Santa Fe Trail, connected to the old Spanish Trail into Southern California. Some took the Panama Isthmus, and some went under the tip of South America. So it doesn't even count all of those people in 1849. And so when you get such a large number and influx of people, right, into the gold fields, they haven't had, by way of the Northwest Ordinance, they haven't established local institutions yet. So they don't have a city council, they don't have a mayor, they don't have a sheriff, they don't have a police department. And so you did have an element of, of anarchy, of no institutions, right, in the gold fields. And that's why the miners kind of ad hoc, they kind of improvised and they created miners associations. They wrote out their own miners' codes of laws and they carried out their own court system and judgment on people. And that's why to this day you have infamous hanging trees in places up the 108 into gold mining territory. So you can find room for, indiscriminate dangers in the West, being quite wild, if you will, and then also opportunities. One, obviously, was mineral wealth. Uh, Arguably, the most traditionally famous book on the gold rush is The World Rushed In by J.S. Holiday. And he begins, as does a presently popular historian, H.W. Brands from Texas. He also begins with primary source quotes from the Spanish newspapers of Mexican California as soon as gold had been found. And they use largely the same, like 3 or 4 quotes, whereby they say in the English translation, no skill, um, no capital or money, no machinery are necessary. All one has to do is extract it from the superficial beds of the rivers, the Cosumnes, the Feather, the American, and a few other famous rivers. And so they said, anybody can do it. It doesn't take skill. You don't need fancy machinery. And some of the numbers they come up with are just ridiculous. Like it was crazy. Like even back then, we're talking thousands of dollars, right? With the money depreciation going back there. Um, so at any rate, if you got there quickly enough, you had mineral wealth opportunities. You had the Comstock lode in Nevada. You had the Black Hills in South Dakota, and other instances in which the first guys who got there became bonanza kings from rags to riches. All right. Then, in addition to that, you have land, right? This is generically the public domain, but it has not been carved out into 6-acre square plots yet and sold uh, by way of auction and or by way of through the land offices in the press, advertised in the newspapers, and just bought at a singular price. Remember, the original Northwest Ordinance price was $1.25 an acre, and they were still offering $1.25 an acre in the antebellum period. in some areas of frontier region. So that was attainable for people. And then they'd enhanced in the 1830s squatters' rights, right? Legally, so that you could get on land and prove that it had not been improved in a decade, and you could have the first rights to buy that portion of land from the rightful owner of that land. So it's not even good enough that you prove that you own the land. If you hadn't cultivated it in 10 years, a squatter could come get upon it, begin farming it, and have first claims to preempt you and buy that portion of your property from you, whether you liked it or not. All right. So squatters' rights were improving. And you also, of course, had all the land that was sold by the railroads, east and west of the railroad tracks. And there you're at the mercy of the railroad because at one point the railroads exacted a pretty high toll for that land, but not always. All right. And so you had acquisition of land, acquisition of mineral wealth. You also had entrepreneurial opportunities to provide a product or a service that was clearly in demand amongst those who were there in the West, right? So, for instance, you have the mining towns and the cow towns, right? The mining towns pretty self-explanatory. They would congregate in their tents, etc., near the mines that they were mining. Sometimes literally in or about the mines that they were mining, and thus formed these small mining towns, right? Well, as they congregated, if you had a way of mining the miners, you would do it. Uh, Cleaning their clothes, offering a restaurant with food, offering an inn for them to sleep in, offering a saloon for them to get a drink, a bordello to have access to a woman, a gambling house to try to make more money, right, off of gambling against others. So there are a myriad of ways that you could mine the miners. In the famous book of The World Rushed In, you had some people who decided that they had seen the elephant, was the expression of that time, because the elephant was the final thing you saw in Barnum and Bailey's circus, expressing the belief that you've seen all there was to see and you're ready to go home. Those returning back eastwardly along the overland trails, they could offer to take people's mail to the nearest post office because you had established the famous Pony Express at 50-mile increments with stations. So you could say, hey, give me a quarter and I'll take your letter that you have for your wife or for your kids or for your parents. And of course, right, with the lack of, the best they had was the telegraph wire, and the telegraph wire had just begun in the 1840s. And so it was rare. It wasn't all the way across the continent yet. And it cost some money to send a telegraph message somewhere. So at any rate, a lot of people were very desperate to know if their loved ones had made it alive. And so people were willing to pay for someone to have their letters of assurance sent to them in the mail. So then, in addition to that, to entrepreneurial opportunities, um, well, actually, those are the major ones: mineral wealth, land, acquisition of land, and entrepreneurial opportunities. So those are some of the ways in which, if someone told me, Derek, you have to write a paper or a book, and it has to adhere to Turner's thesis, right? That's some of the data that I would get into. But I would be fully aware of the fact that while I was choosing certain data to support Turner's thesis, I also was conveniently omitting other types of data that went against it. And that is number 5 is very simple, is racial discrimination. All right. Um, there were two reasons. There were two reasons for which um, the people in California, the Anglos of California, are going to contend that they had a right to, well, not even so much a right, but perhaps two different sources of motivation in discriminating against Latinos. One was the notion that we won California fair and square. We fought you in a war. We won the war. We took California and now it's ours. And to the victor go the spoils, right? And so we've rightfully earned the right to extract this gold. Now, if you look at the map, right, with overland trails, you're talking 2,000 miles. It would take months and months for you to get across the continent. You had to go across the Great Plains, then the Rocky Mountains, then the Great Plateau, or kind of sink, if you will, beneath sea level, and then the Sierra Nevada. And so you had your hands full getting across the continent. And so Mexicans in the northern states, like Sonora and Sinaloa and Coahuila, uh, Chihuahua, they had a much shorter trip. And so Mexicans from northern states were able to beat them to the punch. Now, clearly, Mexican Americans, right, who had gone nowhere, who were already here when it was Mexico, they clearly beat everybody to the punch as they were already here. And then you had the success of the Chileans. Supposedly, Chile has a long history of mining from the time of the Conquista in the 1500s. And they used like mercury, etc., to discern between fool's gold and the real thing. That's just one example of their expertise in mining. So, because a lot of Latinos beat people to the punch in 1848, because some were so adept at mining, like the Chileans, there was a great sense of jealousy, right? Of economic jealousy. And they made it clear. And by the way, another demographic for which there will be much jealousy are the Asian immigrants. Um, a lot of them came from the Guangdong province of China. They had a great war. Oh gosh, I have it in my notes. I think it's the Taiping Rebellion, but it dispossessed and displaced millions of Chinese people. So at this time, you have the coolie system, COOLIE, whereby the Chinese are brought to the Hawaiian Islands, other places in the Pacific, to work as modern indentured servants, all right, agriculturally. And from there, John Sutter, his real name was Johann von Sutter. He was a Swiss guy who was taken in as an impresario under Mexican California. He brought several Hawaiians, Polynesians, Filipino, and Chinese laborers with him. And so you have the introduction of coolie laborers into California. Then, of course, news of the gold rush was global. It was outright global, all throughout Europe, Africa, the Near East, Asia, virtually everywhere. I eventually heard of it, Australia, and made a trek here to try their luck. So the Chinese were no different. But at any rate, there was a guy named Charles Crocker for the Central Pacific Railroad, and he made a famous bet that is Chinese laborers could lay a mile of track in a day. And he bet Durant of the Union Pacific. And he won the bet, and thereby the Chinese gained the stereotype, the image, the popular image of being the stereotypical ideal laborer. They contended that they were diligent, that they were hardworking and disciplined. They contended that they were efficient, that they got a lot done in a set amount of time. And they contended that they were docile, that they did as they were told and they were obedient. And so that constituted, right, that stereotype at least, constituted the ideally exploitable laborer, right? Why hire a self-entitled white American man when you could pay only 60% of that in the wages for a Chinese man, and he'll get more work done, at least in your estimation, according to their reputation. So at any rate, it was such, right, economic jealousy that even in places like Denver, Colorado, the Mexican American community will rise up in violence against the Chinese, even though they're both being discriminated against because they felt like the Chinese were taking their jobs. All right. So at any rate, let's see here. Then, of course, the losing of the land. Um, Firstly, the states were in charge of carrying out the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That's mistake number one. All right. Because oftentimes when you read about populism, like the ugly side of the coin of representative democracy, and you have elected reps kind of appealing to the lowest common denominator, like what they fear, what they hate, what they're greedy for, etc. Right? When you have that, um, Dante, please. At any rate, you're going to have um, with this populism, it just for whatever reasons, plural, I'm sure, uh, populism is stronger at the localized level most of the time, and that's the case here. So they're gonna face more xenophobia from people who were rubbing elbows with them day to day, feeling more of a sense of competition with them, etc. All right. As opposed to Aristotle on habituation and the belief that when you rub elbows with people, you become more cosmopolitan and you become more tolerant because you realize they're just as human as you are, etc. That's an ongoing debate. But here in this narrative, it's just the opposite. It's people that are there in California competing with the Latinos are the ones who hate them the most. So at any rate, you have four miners taxes, 20 per month for non-citizens to use the mines. Okay. Then you had 2 years later a foreign miners tax against any boats that came foreign through Angel Island into San Francisco, and now that was against the Chinese. So at any rate, they're discriminated against de jure by law, right? Um, they're going to it won't take long and people are going to make contracts whereby they're going to contend that you cannot sell your house or rent it to a Mexican family or to a Chinese family or to a black family. I kid you not. And so racial discrimination de facto just happening as it does, and also de jure by law are both going to be a fact here in the West. They're going to segregate them with public swimming pools, public schools, libraries, theaters, etc. They're going to have like a Jim Crow type system for Latinos and for Asians in many of these Western states, including California. All right. We had a Japanese uh, um, public school system in California. So, at any rate, what did California ask? They wanted latitude and longitude lines on a piece of paper. They wanted the governor's signature with a date on it. They wanted permanent property markers. You know, could you imagine if they even did that today, right? I mean, who's holding on to that who has paid their full mortgage, you know, to this day? I have parents who have bought their modest home years past, and I don't think they carry anything like that on their person. So at any rate, that's what they were expected to prove. That's how they were expected to prove it. And so many could not, right? Then, of course, some had temporary markers, trees that had long ceased to exist there, been cut down, etc., as one part of their boundary line, or a river that had switched course, etc. Um, to further complicate it, some people like Richard Stillman, um, they would repeatedly take someone to court just to put up the attorney fees to such a high extent that the Latino landowner would give in and decide to sell it because he was going broke off of lawyer fees. You had shyster lawyers who would put it down in the fine writing that if I win this court case for you, I get a quarter of your land as my legal fees, or even more than a quarter of their land. There are a myriad of ways in which they lost it, at least portions of their land. And then, like I said, with squatters' rights, a lot of the families, the Spanish families going to Southern California, those were large land grants. The Nietos, the Verdugos, they're known by their last name, and they own just thousands, tens of thousands of acres. But also, a lot of their land was pastoral. They had cattle or sheep that roamed freely, and so they weren't cultivating the land. They didn't have rows of tobacco or cotton growing, right, or corn or wheat. And so Anglo squatters, minor squatters would come in and start farming portions of their lands, saying nobody apparently lives here. And even when they proved that that was technically their land, because they hadn't improved it in 10 years, they gave the right to those squatters to purchase those portions of their land from them. So there are a myriad of ways in which they lost their land. There was extortion, there was the threat of violence and the use of violence, there was murder in some cases. Felipe Armesto Diaz from Notre Dame, he has a book, Our America, and he gets into that. All right. So clearly, Mexican Americans and Asian Americans were discriminated against, and that is a convenient omission by Frederick Jackson Turner. Remember, he said that there is equality of opportunity for everybody in the West. Well, according to Chicano historians, there was never equality of economic opportunity. All right. In fact, he contends that Mexicans could only get jobs in the proletariat. Remember, that is the manual laboring class in a new industrializing society and economy. So, of course, you have the famous field workers, the campesinos, and that was very much the case already in the 1840s and 50s in Mexico itself. You had sharecroppers, you had the poor peones, and the peons were the ones who did not rent any portion of the hacendados land, but they oftentimes used debt peonage to keep them indebted and keep them working indefinitely for the owner of the hacienda. And so here as well, although I will say that, the identification of Latinos, of Mexican Americans in particular, with doing migrant field work, that won't become, stereotypically the case roughly until about the time of the Great Depression. Up until that time, it was Asian laborers out on the fields. But already there were plenty of Latinos there. They also were favored to be exploited by several railroad companies and mining companies, like Anaconda copper mines. They like to employ and exploit Mexican Americans. So did the Kansas and Topeka Railroad. All right. And then you have the service sector, where sadly you still have that case in many instances, like domestic workers, waiters, cooks, cleaners, etc. All right. So that's still the case right there, sadly. But at any rate, they were pigeonholed into the proletariat, and culturally, they were told, and the Anglos told themselves, that that's where they belong, that they don't have the brains to do anything else, and that they're good, obedient workers, and they're to do their job, and that's their niche. That's where they belong. That's what they're best at, etc. And it's funny to me, right? how stereotypes can run into their own contradictions. Because remember, you still had the sombrero wearing Mexican man laying against a tree taking a siesta in a lot of the caricatures written in the 1800s. So how could he be lazy, but yet he's the ideal worker that you want to keep doing manual labor for you? So anyway, go figure. All right. So it's called proletariatization to contend that they were pigeonholed into the proletariat and they kind of couldn't get out. And the main ways in which, they showed their agency in dealing with it, they fought back outside of the system. You had social bandits, right? Like Joaquin Murrieta. Joaquin Murrieta basically is Zorro, okay? Fought back against the system, robbed the white man, lived a life of crime, but had like a kind of a political bent to it. You also have there are some holes with that actually. It is biography, but some of it fits. Um, then you have the gorras blancas, the white hats. They would cut the big white corporate barbed wire and release their cattle and their horses and try to give it and disperse it out to the poor Mexican people. You had a guy named Cortina in New Mexico, and he fought a famous salt war for the salt mines that belonged to the Mexican people, and so forth, right? So they fought outside the system, and they fought within the system. Some of them, if you can't beat them, join them, like the infamous Santa Fe Ring. I still want to read a book just on this ring, but Mexican lawyers, Mexican businessmen, Mexican bankers, and Mexican elected politicians still in some areas of New Mexico because of their numbers um, were in on multiple enterprises, some of which were illegal and secret, whereby everyone a part of that ring was supposed to uh, benefit together, benefit individually, simultaneously. And so that's kind of you would imagine though, with the Santa Fe ring, Chicano historians look at them as vendidos, as sellouts to their people. Then you had those who fought within the system to achieve the American dream and 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 enhance their sense of pride in their culture, right? Amongst white collar Latinos. You have that in San Antonio, Texas. You have that in LA, California. You have that in a couple of the cities of New Mexico. But oftentimes, right, their clientele were almost solely Hispanics as well. So that was bittersweet. All right. Um, so they fought within the system, they fought outside the system. Some ran as elected um, politicians who tried to, uh, promote what was best for their people. Guadalupe Vallejo here in California, Esteban Ochoa in Arizona, the Armijo family in New Mexico gained names for standing up for themselves and their people as elected reps. Um, and then also the Mexican American people, they maintain their culture very well. There have been studies like with miscegenation, interethnic marriage and sex, and they found especially when Latina women would marry Anglo men, that by and large their children were raised as Latinos. All right. So at any rate, and then lastly, what tends to go against Turner's thesis of equality of opportunity is Marxist history, right? And with Marxist history, remember, they believe that the capitalist system is inherently Darwinian style. It's parasitical. For someone to win, someone else has to lose. And whoever is better connected and has more money to begin with is going to unfairly win. And that's exactly what they do in some of the books by like, oh shoot, there's a woman named Patricia Lemke. She has a hyphenated last name, Patricia Lemke something. I have her book right behind me somewhere, but at any rate, she adheres to this type of thesis on the West. So for one, right, there's superior capital. Most of the mineral wealth that was gained in the gold rush, Comstock Lode, the Dakotas, etc., right, was extracted hundreds of feet within the mountainsides. You're not going to get that with a pickaxe, right? So they would get these hydraulic, water powered, or pneumatic, air powered drills that were like as big as an oil derrick, and those would extract most of the mineral wealth from the West. Big corporations who hired the regular guys who had come with pickaxes in their dreams and saw those fall apart and now have to receive merely an hourly wage working for these corporations in the mines. And of course, they didn't get um, what's the word I'm thinking of, where you get a bonus, right? If you find an ore of gold, of mineral wealth. There was no that did not happen. And so at any rate, same thing in machinery, farm machinery, the mechanical reaper, the mechanical thresher, and the harvester combine. You can you could just do so much more uh, acreage, and when you have that, you have economies of scale, right? You have so many more pounds of wheat, of corn, etc., than your competitor. You just sell it at a lower price than he can go, and you undersell him. You kind of pull a Walmart on him. All right. Then not only that, you have leverage with the middleman. If you have thousands and thousands of pounds of whatever commodity, right? You can tell the middleman, hey, if you don't store my stuff or if you don't ship my stuff, I'll go to another competitor instead, right? And he'll get to charge me per pound and make a fortune from me. So what do I want in return? I want a rebate. I want you to cut my price down lower than everybody else's. And you'll still win. It'll still be a win-win situation because you'll still be able to charge me for so many thousands of pounds. So they got rebates that the smaller guys didn't get. They also had better connections to the government. Before land went out on auction, of course, they could outbid their competitors as well when they're wealthier. But access to water, right? And the rights to extract water from a given river through an irrigation, the development of an irrigation system. Uh, if you're well connected to government, you had to step up against your competitors. And then, of course, in the case of the railroads, if what you are doing as a big business is said to benefit the entire Western society, then the government helped pay for the costs. And of course, the main case there are the railroads. So I'll end with like a little story is at a place called Muscle Slough in Southern California. These squatters came. No one at that time was claiming the land that they settled upon. They farmed it. They stayed on it. So a local judge granted it to them as squatters' rights. But then comes the Topeka, Kansas Railroad, and they say, "Excuse me, guys, get out. This land is ours, and as is all of the land adjacent to it." Because that was the form of subsidy that was the most common toward railroads, is the federal government would say, okay, for every mile of track you lay, if it's flat land, you get about 11 to 12 acres on each side. If it's desert, then you'll get about 14 acres because it's tougher and drier, right? And if it's mountainous and you have to blow through mountains, we'll give you the most. We'll give you 16 to 18 acres on each side of the tracks. So they're coming through, right? And they're like, sorry, this land is ours now. And the squatters refused to leave. They hired a deputy and a marshal. They came in and they were shot by these squatters who refused to leave, claiming it was their land. But of course, what's the argument, right? Is in our federal system, oftentimes constitutionally, the central Washington, D.C. government prevails over the states and local powers, right? And Congress, our federal Congress, had granted that land to the Topeka, Kansas Railroad, whereby just merely a local California judge had granted it to the squatters. So Congress wins over the local judge anytime. So they brought in soldiers all the way from Arizona into Southern California to fight and kill if need be, to have these squatters removed from their land at Muscle Slop. All right. So according to this last one, right, because of their actual capital, because of their political capital, right? Those who had more money, those who began with more money, namely, we're talking about, right, the corporations, are going to win. So much for equality of opportunity, right? The West was the playground of the rich, as was everywhere else. Okay. So at any rate, I'm going to take this off. Was anybody able to make it? Does anybody have any questions? All right, I'll have this posted for you to watch. You guys have a nice week, okay? All right, bye-bye.